You mentioned Cleveland in growing up. You were a good basketball player. You landed at St. Joe's. You were around other good players and on good teams, and ended up playing at Cleveland State for a while. When did you start to think of basketball seriously as being your career? Was it when you were in high school or a kid, or wasn't it until later?
Yeah, that's a good question. I get that quite a bit. For me, Zach, it started about in the eighth grade. I was, as you know, I played in Barberton, Barberton Middle School, and it was a great experience. We would get up every morning and go to those parks, a lot of different parks in Barberton, Ohio, a lot of competition. And I kind of knew right then and there, my love for basketball was a little bit different. I think all of us, try to figure out follow our passion. That's what I tell our players. And, I knew my career was going to end. I was very fortunate. My high school coach, Tedd Kwasniak, probably had the most impact on my life, as far as, really wanting to coach. His messaging, his care factor was very real. And then, you get a chance to go to Cleveland State and play for a Hall of Famer in Raleigh, Massimino, and learn the ins and outs, preparation. That's where I really fell in love with it, and guys like Jeff Young and Bob Huggins, and, the list goes on and on. You have many guys that you come in contact with that you learn from. And I knew right then and there that at a young age, that's what I wanted to do.
You mentioned the offense before, Coach. Obviously, the name of the game is put the ball in the hoop, but your Youngstown teams were off the charts in the metrics. All the metric sites have this team ranked highly. I think it's 20th in Ken Palm rating. So you want to score, you want to play fast, you want to get in the 90s if you can, right? How much of that is by intent, and how much of that is just the players making it happen?
Yeah, I think it all has to go hand in hand. I think, good players offensively are playing free. They're reading defenses. They're confident. Schematically, you got to know from game to game. You got to understand their pick and roll coverage, off ball screens. You got to be able to really dissect a defense. But, it changed for me about 5 or 6 years ago when I went to Boston, and I really understood and, really studied what Joe was doing with his team. And really what he was doing was teaching his players to make decisions. If you think about basketball, there's so many possessions in a game, right? So we do ID or read drills every day. It could be an off-ball screen read. It could be a pick and roll read. And we want 5 guys on the floor connected that can pass, catch, shoot, and really make good decisions. And I think it really changed me as a coach. The other thing we did, we really started to understand analytics. I think sometimes analytics gets a bad rap. I'm not sure your take on it, but I think you have to trust your eyes, but I think you also have to trust numbers as well.
Give us an example. I mean, what is something that's made you better, made your offense better as you go through the ups and downs of a season?
Yeah, I mean, I think
an analytical example.
Yeah, the biggest thing I look at for our players is how efficient they are, right? So I look at assist to turnover. When we have 19 plus assists, we're very, very, very hard to beat. I think our win percentage is, in the 90s, right? So we want every guy on our roster to understand that. Defensive rebounding percentage has been a big part of things that we're tracking. How many times when the shot goes up, how many times are you hitting your opponent and keeping them away from the ball? Because at the end of the day, Zach, this comes down to possessions. Can you win the possession battle? Defensively, we've really grown. We're 39th today in the country in defense. And I think we recruited to that, lateral movement. When we're looking at different players, we want lateral movement. At the point guard position, we look for a guy that's an extension of our coaching staff, but we want those guys to be pass-first guys. We want those guys to set the table and have a 3-to-1 assist-to-turnover ratio, not just a 2-to-1.
Yeah. When you have a great point guard, do you have a chance, no matter the stage, no matter the level?
Well, I've read a lot of your stuff about our quarterback situation over the years. I think we're up to about 47 of them. I think, I'm hoping what the Browns decide to do is go all in on Sanders. He's our guy. Let's understand that he's got to know the reads. He's got to make the progressions from game to game. And to me, you got to empower those point guards. You got to empower those quarterbacks. Those guys are kind of a big part of your success. So, I think the more confidence you give players nowadays in this transfer portal, in this rev share / NIL world we're living in, you're going to have a different team from year to year. If you can retain 5 to 7 guys, you're really doing something. Your kids really want to play for you. So I think you got to have some stability at that position.